Hey guys, tonight we are beginning a long, slow and quietly curious journey into a world that feels at once familiar and impossibly far away. You are stepping into medieval Europe, not as an observer from a textbook, but as if you yourself are slipping into the dim chamber where an expectant mother prepares to bring a new life into the world. The walls are close, the ceilings low, and the scent of beeswax candles mingles with dried herbs hanging from rafters. You will find yourself here standing in the flicker of golden light, realizing very quickly that medieval childbirth is not something you would likely survive with ease, unless you had a particularly resilient body and a very patient midwife. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are at it, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The air inside this small chamber is warm, slightly smoky from the candlelight, and tinged with the sweet sharpness of rosemary that has been burned in the corners to ward off sickness. You can hear the faint creak of a stool and the rustle of cloth as someone adjusts a heavy wool blanket. It is not silent here. Silence is not really possible in a medieval home, with chickens scratching outside, neighbors whispering in the corridor, and sometimes the thud of a wooden bucket being set down by someone fetching water. Inside, though, there is a hush of concentration. Birth is at once ordinary and sacred. It happens all the time, but in this moment, it feels as though the entire universe has narrowed to this small room. You stand there, uncertain where to look, noticing details you might not expect. There is a stool with 3 legs that looks strangely like a rustic throne, meant for the mother to sit on during labor. There are bundles of dried sage and lavender hanging by the rafters. On the wall, a small wooden cross is half buried in shadow. The midwife moves calmly, as if she has done this dozens of times before, which she likely has, because she is the one trusted woman in the village who knows how to coax babies into the world. Historians still debate just how much genuine medical knowledge such a midwife might have had. Some argue that she relied mostly on tradition, intuition, and trial and error, while others suggest she knew quite a bit about herbal remedies and the body's workings. Either way, she is the anchor of the room, and you sense that without her presence, everyone else would dissolve into nervous chaos. A curious little fact is that many medieval homes kept a birthing stool ready for such events, almost as essential as a cooking pot or a water jug. It was not always a grand piece of furniture, sometimes just a simple wooden contraption stored away until needed. But its presence shows how expected childbirth was, woven into the rhythm of life. You glance at the window and notice that the shutters are drawn, not only against the night air, but against wandering eyes. Birth was private, sometimes almost secretive, and women guarded that privacy fiercely. Outside, the world is full of fields, livestock, and the steady march of seasons. But inside this room, time feels suspended. You hear the shuffle of feet as more women arrive. One carries a basket with cloths. Another has a jug of ale that has been warmed by the fire. Someone is muttering a prayer under her breath. You catch words that speak of saints, of safety, of hope for a quick delivery. Religion, superstition, and practical support all mixed together in the same breath. You shift a little and notice the floor beneath you is rough wood, scattered with straw in some places to soak up any mess. There is no neat tile or smooth surface here, only practicality. Only what can be managed in a world without hospitals or sterile gloves. You begin to sense that childbirth in this time was not simply a biological event, but a deeply social and spiritual one. Everyone has a role, from the woman in labor to the women supporting her, to the unseen saints and charms that are believed to hover invisibly around the room. You look toward the mother, whose face is half lit in the candlelight, and you notice her calm determination. She has likely done this before, perhaps several times, and she knows the rhythm of pain and patience that lies ahead. A strange little detail you may not expect is that sometimes women gave birth not only at home, but in specially designated birthing chambers, decorated with cheerful fabrics, herbs, and sometimes even painted walls, meant to lift the spirits. This was not always possible in a poor village, but wealthier households might create such a space. Historians still wonder whether these decorated rooms actually made much difference in comfort, or whether they were mostly symbolic gestures of care. Either way, it shows how communities tried to make the ordeal a little more bearable. You lean back slightly, feeling the heat of the candles on your face, and you imagine what it must have felt like to be here, not as a visitor, but as someone expected to play a part. Would you fetch water, hold a hand, or simply keep out of the way? The roles were clearly defined, yet each person present carried the weight of hope for a safe outcome. You cannot help but notice how the room itself seems to breathe. Every creak, every whisper, every sigh adds to a rhythm that mirrors the labor itself. This rhythm pulls you along, slowly, steadily, with no rush. Time feels stretched here, each moment lengthened by anticipation. The longer you stand in this dim chamber, the more you realize how different childbirth was in this world. It was risky, it was painful, but it was also ordinary, woven into the cycle of life like planting and harvesting. And so you linger, the golden light flickering against the walls, the air heavy with herbs and smoke, your senses filled with the quiet intensity of a medieval birth chamber. You are still standing in that dim chamber, and as your eyes adjust more fully to the flicker of candlelight, you notice that you are no longer alone, with only the mother and the midwife, because slowly the circle of women has grown wider, and the space has taken on the atmosphere of a gathering that is both solemn and oddly social, as though this little room has been transformed into a temporary community center where birth is the only subject of importance. The women who surround you come in quietly, some with baskets, some with folded cloths, some with bowls of steaming broth that release faint curls of scented steam into the room, and each of them seems to know exactly what part she is expected to play. In medieval Europe, childbirth was not an isolated medical procedure performed in silence by a single physician, but rather a collective female experience, and you can sense that here very clearly. The room has become a female world, set apart from the bustling noise of men's work, politics, and fields. And within this circle, the women gather with a mixture of wisdom, superstition, and social chatter. You hear one woman whispering that she hopes the baby will be born quickly, and another remarking that the last birth she attended took 2 whole nights, as though this event is also a story to be compared to other stories, a kind of living record passed from one set of ears to another. The midwife moves among them with a quiet authority, handing out small tasks and offering calming words, her presence commanding respect. Historians agree that midwives in the medieval world held a curious dual position, respected and necessary, yet sometimes feared or distrusted, especially if the birth did not go well. You notice how the women keep glancing at her, as though waiting for subtle cues, their trust woven into every nod she gives. A fascinating little detail you may not expect is that in some regions midwives swore oaths before local authorities, promising to be honest, discreet, and faithful in their duties. A reminder that even in an era ruled by superstition, there were attempts to regulate and standardize such roles. Still, historians continue to debate how much actual medical skill these women possessed versus how much was ritual, tradition, and intuition carried from one generation to the next. Did they truly understand anatomy, or did they rely on patterns they had observed countless times before? No one can fully answer, but as you stand in this circle, you feel the power of accumulated experience, which is its own kind of knowledge. The women closest to the mother reach for her hand, stroke her forehead, and murmur words of encouragement that are at once practical and poetic, telling her to breathe with the rhythm of the earth, telling her to think of calm waters and strong roots, mixing metaphors of farming rivers and faith in one continuous stream of comfort. Others keep themselves busy preparing linens, boiling water, or simply watching with quiet anticipation, their presence more symbolic than practical. You cannot help but notice that in this small room, the gossip and laughter that occasionally slip out are not out of place but part of the ritual itself. The women talk about neighbors, about husbands who cannot cook for themselves, while their wives are here about silly things that happened at the market. And their chatter forms a counterpoint to the tension in the room, reminding everyone that life goes on even in the midst of a moment that feels monumental. The gossip acts like a pressure valve, allowing nervous energy to escape. You may even hear a quiet laugh when one woman teases another for always arriving late to every birth, a sign that even in such serious circumstances, there was space for humor. Historians still wonder whether the presence of so many women helped to ease the pain by creating a sense of solidarity, or whether the noise and bustle added stress. But standing here, you feel that solidarity outweighs the rest. The circle of women is not only a practical support system, but a symbolic shield, guarding the mother from fear, loneliness, and perhaps unseen forces. They bring with them not only their hands and their words, but also their faith, their charms, and their accumulated stories. If you look carefully at their clothing, you notice that some wear small amulets pinned to their dresses, tiny tokens meant to bring luck or ward off danger, and you realize that every woman in this room has brought a piece of herself into the ritual. This is no sterile procedure, but a communal act, woven from 100 little threads of human connection. You begin to sense that you are no longer merely watching childbirth, but entering a living tradition, one that stretches back centuries and binds people together through shared hope and fear. And so you stand in the glow of candles, in the warmth of bodies pressed close in a small room, surrounded by the murmur of female voices, realizing that the circle of women around you is not only about childbirth, but about survival continuity and the weaving of community itself. The candles burn lower, dripping little rivers of wax down their sides, and the air in the room grows warmer, thicker, as the women around you continue their vigil. And now your attention is drawn to the small bundle of objects placed carefully on a wooden stool beside the Mother-S bed. Objects that look ordinary at first glance, but are layered with meaning and ritual. A wooden cross rests there, polished by countless hands that have gripped it during moments of pain. A small pouch filled with herbs tied with rough twine gives off a faint, sharp scent, a mixture of sage, rue, and maybe a sprig of rosemary. And there is a wax tablet on which a short Latin prayer has been scratched with uneven letters. These are the charms of medieval childbirth, little talismans against the vast unknown, and they carry a weight that feels almost heavier than the steaming bowl of broth simmering in the corner. You lean closer and realize that some of the women wear strings of beads tucked discreetly into their sleeves, ready to be fingered in moments of anxiety, and the midwife herself has a ribbon tied tightly around her wrist, its end stained with something that looks suspiciously like dried wax, a reminder of previous births she has attended. Medieval people lived in a world where faith and magic were not separate categories, but rather overlapping circles, so it makes sense that childbirth, a moment of immense risk, would be wrapped in layers of both prayer and spell. The midwife mutters softly words you cannot quite catch, perhaps a psalm, perhaps an incantation passed down from her own teacher, and she ties a little scrap of fabric to the bed frame, as though binding the room itself into safety. A fascinating fact here is that some women in medieval Europe wore relics or even carried tiny slips of parchment with scripture written on them, believing the sacred words themselves held protective power. Less known is the practice of suspending keys above the bed, a symbolic act thought to open the path for the child's safe passage, a simple household object transformed into a mystical tool. Historians still wonder whether these rituals genuinely comforted the women, or whether they increased anxiety by constantly reminding them of the dangers ahead. But as you watch, you feel that in a time when medical science was thin and unreliable, even the smallest ritual gave a sense of control. The mother now clutches the wooden cross as another wave of pain takes her, her knuckles whitening her breath, coming in short bursts. And the women around her chant softly, sometimes overlapping, sometimes falling into an almost musical rhythm that seems to tether her to the earth. You notice one woman sprinkling a few drops of water across the threshold of the room, a habit so casual that you almost miss it. But you realize it is another layer of protection, a quiet ritual against evil spirits or bad luck slipping in with the draft. And then there is a moment of stillness when the midwife pauses, holds her hand up and listens. You find yourself holding your breath too, waiting for her verdict. And after a beat, she nods and tells the mother to change her position. The bed creaks as the women help her shift, their movements both practical and ceremonial, because in these shifts there is hidden knowledge, the kind passed down not in books, but in hands-on practice, gestures repeated across centuries. There is humor too, unexpectedly. as one of the women remarks that the baby is already proving stubborn, just like the father, and a ripple of laughter spreads through the room, easing the tension. You feel how essential these little bursts of humor are, like sparks of light in the dense air. A curious fact is that in some medieval towns, bells were rung when a woman went into labor, summoning neighbors to prayer, or simply marking the moment for the community. And though you hear no bell here, you imagine how the sound might have carried across a quiet village night, mingling hope with fear. Historians still debate the line between medicine and magic in these practices. Were these women healers, witches, or simply practical caregivers who leaned on whatever tools they had? You cannot answer, but standing in this room you sense that these rituals, however superstitious they might seem, have their own kind of healing force, not in curing the body but in soothing the spirit. The candles flare a little as if in agreement, and the faint hum of women's voices fills the air again, weaving prayer and gossip and laughter into one seamless fabric that wraps the mother as securely as any blanket. The hours stretch on, and though the candles burn lower, the room remains alive with movement, whispers, and the steady rhythm of the mother's breathing as she drifts between pain and brief moments of rest. And now your gaze drifts to the midwife's tools spread carefully on a cloth beside her. They look humble, wooden, iron, bone, but in the flickering torchlight they carry an aura of quiet authority, each one crafted not for beauty, but for use, each one whispering its own story of countless births attended. There is a small iron knife not for surgery as you might first think, but for cutting cords or perhaps trimming strips of cloth, a pair of blunt hooks, worn smooth from handling used in dire emergencies, though no one speaks of that aloud, and bundles of herbs tied tightly together, some fragrant, some pungent each, with a purpose known by heart. The midwife dips her hand into a small clay bowl filled with oil, rubbing it between her palms, before resting them firmly on the mother's belly, murmuring reassurance, and the scent rises sharp and earthy, cutting through the heaviness of the room. A widely known fact is that midwives often carried oils like olive or linseed, sometimes infused with herbs, to ease discomfort or anoint the body, creating both practical relief and spiritual comfort. A less known detail is that some kept carved amulets, small bones or tokens shaped like animals, tucked discreetly in their aprons, believing these hidden objects lent strength or speed to the birthing process. Historians still wonder whether these objects were personal quirks, remnants of folk belief or a secret network of knowledge stretching across villages, passed quietly from midwife to midwife. You watch as the tools are handled with practiced ease, nothing wasted, nothing rushed, and you realize that in this world, the midwife herself is the most important instrument, her knowledge carried not in books, but in memory, sharpened by every cry, every breath, every life she has helped usher into the world. A ripple of laughter surfaces when one of the women teases the midwife about her lucky apron, so stained and patched it looks older than the village itself, and she replies dryly that perhaps it is the apron that does the real work, not her hands. The room softens in that laughter, tension eased by humor, and you feel how vital it is in a space like this. The tools may be simple, but in them lies centuries of trial and error, faith and resilience, and as you stand quietly among the women, you sense the weight of that lineage pressing into the room, as if every midwife before this one has left a whisper behind. The night outside grows cooler, though inside the chamber the warmth of bodies, the glow of fire, and the intensity of the birth keep the air heavy. And now your focus drifts to the role of the men who hover uneasily at the edges of this world, for childbirth in medieval times was largely a women's domain. Yet the presence or absence of men tells you much about the society surrounding this fragile moment. The husband, if he is nearby, is often kept in another room pacing back and forth, perhaps muttering prayers or wearing grooves into the wooden floor with his anxious footsteps, for men were rarely welcomed into the birthing space itself. It is seen as a sacred circle of women, one where male eyes might disturb the balance of ritual and privacy, and so he waits straining to catch every muffled sound, while female relatives and neighbors handle the work of comforting, guiding, and bearing witness. A well-known fact is that in many medieval households, the husband would not see the newborn until after the midwife had declared the birth successful, a safeguard against overwhelming hope too soon. But a lesser-known detail is that in certain towns, fathers were tasked with fetching warm water or preparing bread and ale for the attendants, small practical duties that tethered them, however loosely, to the experience unfolding in the chamber. You imagine him now standing with a clay jug in his hands, listening intently, torn between relief that he is not inside and guilt that he cannot share the burden. Historians still wonder whether this separation left men relieved or resentful, for while some records suggest that exclusion preserved the dignity of women's work, others hint at frustration, a sense that men were denied access to the most profound moment of family life. Meanwhile, priests might be summoned if the labor grew long or perilous, offering blessings at the threshold, sprinkling holy water, or reciting scripture that drifted faintly into the room without intruding fully upon it. In wealthy households, scribes sometimes noted the birth as it happened, recording prayers, vows, or promises to donate candles to the local church if the mother survived, small bargains with heaven that mingled faith with desperation. You notice too that men's voices when they enter this world tend to come from outside the chamber. The muffled shout of a father calling for news, the cautious knock of a messenger announcing that a priest has arrived, the low murmur of male servants moving wood to keep the fire alive. It is almost comical to see how carefully they orbit the edges of this drama, like nervous planets circling a sun they cannot approach, yet they know everything in their future depends on it. There is humor here as well, for one of the women jokes softly that the husband will likely faint if he ever dares step inside, and the room fills with a ripple of knowing laughter, for apparently fainting men were not rare when allowed into births. The idea of the strong protector reduced to a heap on the floor adds a touch of irony to the otherwise solemn night. A curious custom emerges in your thoughts. In some parts of Europe, when the baby was born, fathers were expected to lie down in bed themselves, pretending to recover, as though they had endured the labor too, a practice called couvade, which blurred the line between sympathy and absurdity. Historians debate its meaning. Was it mockery, solidarity, or a symbolic sharing of pain? But whatever its roots, it lingers as a reminder that men could never quite decide whether to be distant witnesses or honorary participants. As the labor continues, you sense how these roles create a circle, women within, men without, both bound by fear, hope, and the weight of expectation. You glance toward the door and imagine the husband straining to hear, every shuffle of feet and every sudden silence magnified in his ears, and though he does not step across the threshold, his presence is felt, as constant and anxious as the rhythm of the mother's breath. The night deepens and the chamber seems suspended outside of time, yet you notice how nourishment weaves itself into the scene. For childbirth in the medieval world was not only a test of endurance, but also a matter of energy, and the food and drink prepared for such occasions were as symbolic as they were practical. A heavy wooden table against the wall bears a pitcher of ale, a loaf of coarse bread and a bowl of broth that has been kept simmering for hours, its steam curling lazily upward and mingling with the smoke from the candles. Women attending the birth take turns sipping from the ale, which is weaker than modern beer and closer to liquid bread, providing warmth and steady calories, while the broth, rich with onions, herbs, and perhaps a scrap of salted meat, waits for the mother once her strength allows her to eat. A widely known fact is that medieval households relied heavily on ale and pottage for daily sustenance, so it is no surprise that these appear here. But a lesser-known detail is that certain foods were thought to carry special powers during childbirth. Cheese, for example, was sometimes offered to symbolize nourishment and continuity, while sweetened cakes might be baked in wealthier homes to celebrate the survival of both mother and child. Historians still debate whether these foods were intended more for genuine sustenance or for their ritual value. But here, in the warmth of the chamber, you sense that both matter equally. You watch as one of the women breaks off a piece of bread, dips it in the broth, and gently offers it to the mother, who chews slowly between contractions, each bite a fragile tether keeping her anchored. You cannot help but smile at the midwife's sharp reminder that too much food is unwise. "We do not want to feed the child more than it already demands," she mutters dryly, and the room chuckles at her familiar wit. The humor slices through the tension, reminding everyone that even in moments of risk, laughter is another form of nourishment. Your eyes catch on a small bundle of herbs hanging near the hearth, perhaps fennel or dill, chosen not only for flavor, but for their supposed power to ward off ill fortune or soothe troubled stomachs. It strikes you that food here is more than sustenance. It is an unspoken language of comfort, ritual, and community. A curious detail comes to mind. In some households, a celebratory feast would follow the birth neighbors gathering with bread, cheese, and spiced wine. But these gatherings sometimes blurred into gossip sessions where the details of the birth were recounted with dramatic flair. You imagine how, years later, the story of this very night might be retold in kitchens and market stalls, each retelling flavored by the food and drink shared alongside it. The smell of broth thickens as the fire pops, and you find yourself growing drowsy from the mingling scents, lulled by the rhythmic motions of women ladling, stirring and passing cups from hand to hand. There is something profoundly grounding about this exchange of food, this simple acknowledgement that in the midst of mystery and risk, the body still needs warmth and fuel. And as you watch the mother take another careful sip of ale, you realize that these humble foods carry as much weight in this ritual as the prayers whispered under breath or the relics tucked beneath pillows. The hours stretch on, and the chamber grows hazy with candle smoke and the smell of sweat and herbs, and your thoughts drift toward the rhythms of sound that shape this experience. Because childbirth in the medieval world was not a silent affair, but one filled with chanting, groaning, muttering, and even singing, all of it, weaving into a strange, almost hypnotic symphony that carries everyone through the long night. You notice how the midwife hums under her breath, a low tune without words, steady as a drumbeat, and the women around her join in with murmured prayers, fragments of familiar psalms or local lullabies that blur into one another until they sound more like a stream than separate voices. The mother herself moans with each contraction, her voice raw and unashamed, and those sounds are met not with alarm, but with nods of recognition, as though every woman in the room carries the memory of her own cries, or the cries of her mothers before her. A widely known fact is that prayers were often recited during childbirth, especially invocations to saints associated with protection, but a lesser-known detail is that some communities believed specific chants or repeated syllables could physically ease the passage of the child. The vibrations of sound believed to align body and spirit. Historians still debate whether this was superstition or an early recognition of how rhythm and sound calmed the nervous system. But as you stand here, you cannot deny the effect. The entire room feels steadied by the hum like a boat rocked gently on a tide. One woman begins telling a quiet story between contractions, recounting how her own child arrived during a thunderstorm, and though her tale is unremarkable, the rhythm of her words draws smiles and sighs, filling the space with something familiar and human. Another woman lets out a soft laugh, teasing that babies always seem to choose the worst hours to arrive, and the laughter ripples, lightening the heaviness. Even the fire joins in, popping sharply now and then, its crackles punctuating the chorus of voices. You realize that silence would be unbearable in this moment, that the noise is not chaos but comfort, proof of life pressing against fear. A curious custom surfaces in your memory. In some villages, drums or bells were struck outside the home during labor, not to alarm but to guide the spirit of the child safely into the world, a practice that blurred the line between music and ritual. You wonder whether the sounds comforted the mother or frightened her with their urgency, but perhaps the true audience was the community itself, waiting and listening. Here, though, within these walls, sound is intimate, textured, layered, from the rasp of cloth being wrung out to the soft clatter of wooden cups set down on a table. You notice your own breathing falling into step with the rhythm, slow and steady. And you imagine how easy it would be to drift into sleep, carried by this soundscape. The mother grips the edge of the bed, groaning once more. And as she does, the women hum louder, a chorus rising like a tide. And you sense that the sound itself becomes a rope, pulling her forward, holding her steady, guiding her through the storm of her own body. The air in the chamber feels thick now, almost tangible, as though it has absorbed every breath, every prayer, every groan, and your attention shifts to the physical positions that the mother takes as the midwife urges her to change and adapt, because childbirth in the medieval world was not confined to lying flat in bed, as it so often is in modern times, but instead was an active process where the body was shifted, lifted and arranged in ways believed to help the baby find its path. And though her legs tremble with exhaustion, The women encourage her, whispering encouragement, telling her that the earth itself will lend her strength if she stands upon it. A well-known fact is that medieval women often gave birth sitting upright on a stool, designed specifically for the purpose, a birthing chair or birthing stool, which left the midwife space to work below and relied on gravity as an ally. But here is the lesser-known detail. These stools were sometimes elaborately carved with symbols etched into the wood, crosses, flowers, or even runes, blurring the line between tool and talisman, and many were passed down through families as heirlooms carrying the history of generations in their worn surfaces. The stool in this room looks plain, its wood darkened by years of use, but as the mother lowers herself onto it, clutching the carved handles, you sense that it holds a quiet dignity, as though it has seen more beginnings than any person alive. Historians still debate how widespread these stools were, for in poorer households women might simply squat, kneel or lean against the bed, while the midwife crouched to assist. But across records, one truth repeats. Movement was considered vital, and the idea of lying still through labor would have seemed strange, even wasteful. You observe the women shifting positions with her, helping her lean forward, adjusting her legs, rubbing her back in circles, all of it guided by practical wisdom honed through centuries of practice. A ripple of humor emerges when one attendant mutters that babies always seem to wait until everyone's arse backs ache from bending, and the others chuckle knowingly, stretching their own stiff shoulders. You cannot help but smile at the image of midwives across centuries, complaining about the same sore muscles, their work demanding as much endurance as the birth itself. A curious practice surfaces. In some accounts, ropes were hung from beams in the ceiling, allowing women to grasp and pull during contractions, their strength channeled upward, the motion grounding them while also lifting some of the burden. You glance upward and wonder if this household ever employed such a tool. The beams dark with soot and age, but sturdy enough to bear the strain. The mother shifts again, sweat dripping from her brow, and her attendants wipe her face with cloths dipped in cool water, whispering reassurance, urging her to keep moving, keep breathing, keep leaning into the process. And symbolic, embodying the belief that the body is an instrument that can be tuned, adjusted, and guided toward life. You sense how the rhythm of movement itself becomes a ritual, a dance of exhaustion. The night lingers on, and by now the chamber feels like a world unto itself, cut off from the village beyond. And you notice how the air carries not only the smell of smoke and herbs, but also the constant touch of hands, for touch in medieval childbirth is as vital as words. A language of its own that passes from woman to woman without needing explanation, sometimes applying sudden pressure when she senses the body tightening, and you realize how much knowledge is carried in the skin rather than in speech. A well-known fact is that midwives often used oils to anoint and massage, easing both discomfort and dryness. But a lesser-known detail is that in some households, warm stones wrapped in cloth were pressed against aching muscles, simple heat therapy that sounds surprisingly familiar even to a modern ear. Historians still wonder whether these techniques were learned through trial and error, or inherited from traditions far older than medieval Europe. But you suspect it is both, the wisdom of countless generations distilled into simple gestures. You watch as the attendants rub the mother's arms, stroke her hair back from her damp forehead, and hold her hands when she groans, their touches weaving reassurance into the rhythm of labor. It strikes you how often people imagine history in grand battles or dusty manuscripts, yet here, in the press of a hand against a shoulder, lies the heartbeat of survival. Humor, too, slips in through touch. One of the women pats the husband's cloak hanging on the wall and mutters that it is too fine to use for wiping sweat, and the laughter that follows eases the tension once again. You notice how the baby is not yet here, but already the act of touch builds community, each stroke of cloth and hand creating a shared memory that will echo long after the cries fade. A curious custom drifts into your thoughts. In some villages, it was believed that rubbing the soles of the mother's feet could encourage the baby to descend, a practice both practical in stimulating circulation and symbolic in urging the journey forward. Though whether it worked or not remains an open question. The room continues to pulse with the language of hands, steady, soothing, insistent. Every gesture a thread in the tapestry of this night. The fire glows softer now, its warmth joined by the warmth of bodies leaning close, And as you watch, you realize that touch here is more than comfort. It is a way of saying you are not alone. You will not be left adrift in this moment. We are with you until the end. The candles have melted low and the air feels heavy with expectation. And as you watch the scene unfold, you realize that the very room itself plays an important role in the story of childbirth. For medieval households were not designed with comfort in mind, and yet when a woman labored, her chamber became the stage where family, faith, and fortune all converged, transforming plain timber and stone into a place of mystery. The walls are close, the plaster uneven and smoke-stained from years of firelight. The rafters above hung with herbs, dried fish, or bundles of flax, objects of daily survival that now take on a silent witness role as the mother cries out below them. The floor is strewn with rushes, their grassy scent faint beneath the stronger odors of sweat, smoke, and the sharp tang of burning tallow. And you imagine the uneven boards creaking as women shift their weight, pressing close to help. A well-known fact is that most medieval homes were single-room or two-room structures, their hearth the center of life, and thus births often took place in the same space where meals were cooked, children slept, and tools were stored, blending the sacred moment of new life with the ordinary clutter of daily existence. A lesser-known detail is that women sometimes attempted to create a more sacred environment by closing shutters, hanging cloth across open doorways, or scattering protective herbs in corners, the transformation of a common room into a birthing chamber, requiring only intention and ritual rather than new architecture. Historians still wonder how much privacy truly existed for medieval women in these cramped spaces. Did the act of childbirth feel communal with neighbors coming and going freely? Or did attendants fiercely guard the chamber, creating a pocket of seclusion in a world where walls were thin and boundaries fragile? You notice how the flickering light paints shadows across the beams, how the smoke curls lazily upward, and you cannot help but think that the environment itself must have shaped the mood of every birth, for a dark, drafty chamber with creaking timbers surely carried a different energy than the warm, fire-bright halls of a wealthy manor. In those wealthier households, births might take place in bedchambers hung with tapestries, the air heavy with incense. And records suggest noble women often labored surrounded by symbols of their family's lineage, reminding everyone of the dynastic weight on each tiny life. Humor creeps in when one of the women here mutters that the rafters seem more crowded with drying onions than with holy relics, and another replies that onions at least will keep away both evil spirits and hungry husbands. The laughter rings warm, a reminder that even in spaces marked by fear, humor binds people closer. You glance again at the small windows shuttered tight against the cool night, and you imagine how the outside world continues without pause. Dogs barking, wind sweeping through fields, owls hunting silently, all unaware of the drama inside. There is something both humbling and profound about this contrast. The chamber feels like the entire universe, yet outside, the stars look down indifferent. A curious custom surfaces in your thoughts. In some regions, thresholds of houses were sprinkled with grain or salt before a birth, not just to protect against spirits, but to signal to passers-by that sacred work was happening inside, as though the house itself had temporarily become a temple. You wonder if such rituals genuinely reassured the women inside, or if they were more for the neighbors who wanted to believe they had contributed protection. Here the chamber feels both ordinary and extraordinary, a simple space lit by flickering fire, yet also a crucible where pain and hope collide. You take in the arrangement. The stool positioned near the hearth, the cloth spread carefully on the bed in case of need, the herbs hanging overhead that seem to whisper with the draught, and you realize that this room, humble as it is, has been transformed by repetition into something timeless. Countless women have labored here before. Countless cries have echoed against these same beams. Countless first breaths have mingled with smoke rising toward the rafters, and the continuity of it all presses against you like a tide. You think, perhaps, that this is why people decorated with charms and prayers, not because the room itself was extraordinary, but because they wanted to inscribe meaning into walls that had already seen so much life and death. The mother moans again, clutching the worn wood of the stool, and the women lean closer, their voices murmuring, their hands adjusting, and the room itself seems to breathe with them, the rafters groaning faintly, the fire sighing, the shadows swaying, as if the very structure of the house has joined in the labor. The night deepens, and as the labor stretches on, you begin to notice not just the chamber and its walls, but the rhythms that fill it, the small sounds and gestures that become the music of childbirth, a steady backdrop of murmurs, sighs, and prayers that carry the mother through each contraction. You hear the midwife's voice, low, calm, almost chant-like, as she instructs the mother to breathe slowly. Though in truth there was no scientific understanding of breathing techniques, only the wisdom of keeping her steady and focused, and her tone is more spell than instruction, weaving reassurance into the air. A widely accepted fact is that medieval midwives were not formally trained doctors, but community figures, often older women with practical knowledge gathered from years of observing births, their authority rooted in experience rather than in parchment. Yet here comes a lesser-known detail. Many midwives had their own secret chants, whispered prayers, or small ritual movements that they believed could ease pain or coax a child into the world more smoothly, a mix of folk tradition and personal creativity. And though some may dismiss these as superstition, you cannot deny the comfort such rhythms bring to the women in the chamber. The midwife here taps the stool gently 3 times, a small ritual you have noticed her repeat before each contraction, and the women follow her lead, creating a cadence of encouragement. Soft humming, murmured invocations, the gentle clink of beads as someone counts prayers. Historians still wonder whether these sounds functioned more as spiritual acts or as psychological anchors, but in this moment you feel their power. The chamber becomes a cocoon of sound where every word is bent toward survival. You notice the humor woven lightly among the tension. One attendant jokes that the midwife's humming sounds suspiciously like a tavern song-ho, to which the midwife replies without missing a beat that taverns and birthrooms both echo with shouting, so perhaps the tune is fitting. The women laugh, and the mother manages a brief smile through her sweat, and the room's mood lightens, for laughter, however fleeting, is one of the oldest medicines. The rhythm shifts as the contractions intensify, the mother gripping the stool so tightly, her knuckles whiten, the midwife pressing warm cloths against her back, another woman fanning her gently with a folded piece of linen. Though the night is cool, you realize that these gestures form a choreography, an unspoken dance passed from generation to generation. One woman steadies, one soothes, one prays, each role as essential as the midwife's central command. The air is thick now with the mingling of smells, smoke, sweat, herbs, and you imagine how these very scents became etched into memory for countless families, the smell of childbirth not just physical, but symbolic of hope and survival. A strange detail surfaces in your mind. Some chronicles mention women beating small drums or clapping rhythmically during difficult births, as if to jar stubborn souls into entering the world, though no one knows how widespread this practice truly was. You wonder if it was more about keeping the mother's mind anchored to sound, drowning out fear, or if it truly was believed to summon the child with percussion. In the glow of the hearth, you notice how the midwife's shadow sways across the wall, her hands steady, her posture firm, and you think about the thousands of times this same dance must have played out across centuries, each midwife adding her own rhythm, her own voice, her own set of comforting lies or brave truths, whispered into the ears of laboring women. The contractions grow closer now, the rhythm in the room quickening like a drumbeat, the women's voices rising with each wave, and you realize that the chamber itself seems to pulse with them, the walls, the fire, even the rafters joining in the effort. It is both terrifying and beautiful, a reminder that birth in this world is not just a physical act, but a communal performance, stitched together from sound, gesture, and faith. You lean in closer, watching, listening, breathing with them, feeling yourself pulled into the rhythm, as though you too are part of this ancient chorus. The chamber feels heavier now, the fire dimming into embers that glow with a low orange pulse, and you sense the weight of hours pressing down on everyone present for labor. In these times is not something measured neatly by clock faces, but by how long candles last, how often water must be reheated, and how many prayers are whispered before lips grow dry. You remain close to the mother, who leans forward on the stool, her hair plastered to her cheeks with sweat, her breaths long and ragged as though each one drags her across a shoreline of exhaustion. A widely known fact is that medieval childbirth often lasted many hours, sometimes even stretching into days, and in this dim room you understand why so many called it both a miracle and a trial. The midwife continues her measured work, her hands steady, her instructions rhythmic. Yet you notice a lesser-known detail in her behavior. Between contractions, she traces a small circle with her thumb on the mother's shoulder, a gesture so subtle it could be overlooked, but it carries with it a silent reassurance, as if reminding her that touch itself is a form of medicine. The women around her lean in closer now, their roles sharpening as the labor nears its most perilous stage. One, adjusting cloths, another, readying fresh water, another murmuring a psalm about safe passage, each voice layering into a quiet choir. Historians still debate the exact mixture of medical practice and ritual in these moments. Were these gestures of care believed to physically shape the outcome? Or were they survival strategies for the mind ways of convincing everyone that they were not powerless against nature's tides? You wonder at this, while the midwife instructs the mother to push harder, her own voice rising above the din for the first time all night, not a shout, but a forceful command, and the room seems to hold its breath. The pressure is palpable. Even you feel your own muscles tense with each contraction, your body almost mirroring hers, proof that empathy is an old and stubborn reflex. A soft joke arises when one attendant, fumbling nervously, drops a cloth into the basin, splashing water on the midwife's shoes, and she mutters that at least her feet will be baptized, a remark that pulls a small laugh from the exhausted circle. Humor here is not frivolous. It is survival, a crack of light against a wall of darkness. The chamber grows hotter despite the late hour, the mingled scents of herbs, sweat and smoke thickening the air, and you can almost taste the bitterness of sage at the back of your throat. You think about how many generations of women endured this same gauntlet, each birth an echo of those before it, each stool polished by countless grips of white-knuckled hands, each hearth lit for the same desperate vigil. You recall reading that in some places, charms were tied to the stool itself, scraps of fabric or carved symbols thought to channel divine favor, though whether these truly comforted or merely distracted remains uncertain. The mother groans louder now, her cries filling the chamber with a raw sound that drowns out all else. And for a moment it feels like the whole house leans in to listen, the beams creaking as if in sympathy. You sense the gravity of this stage, the razor-thin line between triumph and tragedy, and you realize that in this time, survival is not guaranteed, only fought for breath by breath. The midwife's hands move with steady precision, her voice both fierce and soothing as she urges the mother onward, and you see in her eyes a practiced mixture of confidence and concern, for she has walked this road many times and knows too well its dangers. The minutes stretch, the contractions surge, and the rhythm of the room becomes one of straining effort and hushed prayers, each person tethered to the outcome. You breathe with them, caught in the tide, your own body swaying slightly, as though pulled by the same unseen current. And you realize that this is not simply a moment of history, but a timeless ritual, repeated endlessly in every culture, in every era, a thread binding humanity together through pain and hope. The air in the chamber feels charged now, a dense weight pressing down on everyone as the moment of arrival approaches, and you can sense the collective anticipation, as if every person in the room has leaned forward at the same time, caught in a shared breath that refuses to release. The mother grips the stool with a strength that surprises you, her knuckles bone white, her body trembling with the effort of each push, her cries echoing off the wooden beams overhead, mingling with the low chorus of encouragement that surrounds her. A widely accepted fact is that the birthing stool was designed to use gravity itself as an ally, the open seat allowing the child to descend more easily. And as you watch her lean into the stool has-worn frame, you see how practicality and tradition merged into this humble yet vital tool. But here comes a lesser-known detail. In some villages, the stool was passed down through generations and was thought to carry with it the strength of all the women who had given birth upon it, a lineage of survival carved invisibly into its wood. You can almost feel that weight now, as though ghosts of countless mothers hover nearby, adding their silent encouragement to the scene. The midwife kneels low, her hands steady, her eyes sharp with focus, murmuring instructions that are part command, part prayer, part ritual, her tone rising and falling with the rhythm of the labor. You notice the attendants too, one brushing damp strands of hair from the mother's forehead, another holding a cup of water to her lips, another fanning gently at the smoky air, all weaving their efforts together like threads in a fabric of support. Yet beneath the steadiness lies an open question that historians still debate. How much of medieval childbirth was survival due to the care? It is a question you feel pressing into the room as the contractions grow sharper, the pauses shorter, the cries more guttural. And the room surges with energy. Every face tense, every prayer louder, every heartbeat faster. The smell of herbs and sweat thickens the chamber, mingling with the faint metallic tang of effort, a scent as old as humanity itself, and you realize you are witnessing one of history's most universal moments. Life arriving out of pain. A fleeting laugh erupts when the midwife, steady as stone, mutters that the child is as stubborn as a mule, which draws chuckles even in this tense moment, and the humor slices through the fear like sunlight through clouds. The mother gathers her strength, her body straining, and the room seems to tilt with her effort. Time itself holding still, every soul waiting for the sound they long to hear. The midwife leans closer, her hands ready, her eyes unwavering, and you realize that this fragile instant, this edge between silence and a newborn-esque cry, has been lived by countless generations, each one a bridge between the old and the new, the past and the future. You feel your own chest tighten as though you too are part of this collective exertion, your breath matching theirs, your body swaying in time with the rhythm of the labor. The chamber is no longer just a room, but a stage upon which the oldest drama of humanity unfolds, written in sweat, prayer, and sheer will. And then, as the mother summons her final strength, the silence grows deafening, a vast pause filled with tension, with hope, with fear. A pause that has stretched across centuries in every birthing chamber ever lit by firelight. You lean forward, caught completely in the moment, waiting for what must come next, waiting for the sound that will break the chamber open and remind everyone why they endured the night. The chamber bursts alive with the sound you have been waiting for, the sharp, thin cry of a newborn piercing through the smoky air, cutting across exhaustion and fear with the clarity of a bell rung at dawn. And you feel a collective exhale sweep through the room as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath. The mother collapses back onto the stool, her shoulders slumping, her face awash with both tears and relief, her whole body trembling from the effort, while the midwife lifts the tiny, wriggling form high enough for all to see her hands, careful, yet confident, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction that borders on triumph. A widely known fact is that medieval midwives were responsible not just for guiding birth, but also for the immediate care of the infant, ensuring it drew breath, clearing its tiny mouth, and binding its cord with linen or wool thread, tasks they performed with practiced hands honed over decades. Yet here is a lesser-known detail. In some places, a midwife would whisper a secret blessing into the baby's ear before handing it to the mother. A few words meant only for that child, a ritual of protection and welcome that no one else ever heard. And as you watch this, midwife murmur something soft and private. You wonder what promise she has just given. The attendants break into laughter, and soft tears, some clapping their hands lightly, one muttering that the child's cry is as loud as a rooster and will surely wake the entire village, a remark that draws smiles even from the weary mother. Historians still debate whether the celebratory rituals that followed birth were primarily religious or community-based, for while churches recorded baptisms and prayers, much of the earliest joy unfolded in rooms like this one, lit by firelight and filled with laughter and relief. And perhaps those fleeting moments mattered even more than official rites. You notice the smells shifting now, less of sweat and smoke, and more of freshly heated cloths and warm milk, the sense of new life settling into the chamber. The midwife wraps the child in linen, binding it snugly, and for a brief instant, you marvel at how fragile and how powerful such a tiny form can be, carrying with it the future of a family, a village, a world. The mother, though drained and pale, stretches out her arms with trembling eagerness, and when the baby is placed against her chest, the room seems to soften, the tension dissolving into a hum of contentment, as though the cries, the prayers, the fear all find resolution in this one tender embrace. A quiet joke surfaces as one attendant teases that the child already looks stubborn, refusing to unclench its fists, and another replies that clenched fists will serve it well in a world as hard as this one, drawing knowing chuckles. You watch as the fire flickers lower, casting long shadows across the chamber, and you realize that what you are seeing now is not merely a medical act but a communal renewal, the continuation of lineage and memory, a reminder that every birth was also a promise that life would continue despite hardship. You think of how many generations have repeated this ritual, each child's first cry weaving into the great chorus of history, each chamber a tiny theater of survival and hope. The midwife tends to the mother, offering water, checking her carefully, her movements brisk yet tender. For she knows the dangers are not fully past, that the hours after birth are still perilous. But she balances vigilance with celebration, allowing the joy to linger. The baby shifts, yawns, and cries again, and the sound is less desperate now, more insistent, as though demanding recognition of its arrival, and the women laugh once more, saying the household has gained not just a child, but a herald. You lean back slightly, your own breath slowing as the atmosphere eases into calm, and you realize you are witnessing both an ending and a beginning, the close of a night's trial and the dawn of a new life. The chamber grows quieter now, the earlier rush of sound fading into the steady crackle of the fire and the faint coos of the newborn nestled against its mother's chest, and you can almost feel the whole house sigh in relief, the beams above and the stones below relaxing after holding the weight of so much effort and fear. The midwife moves more slowly now, her hands no longer urgent but careful, tying off the cord with practiced precision, cleaning the child with warmed cloths, and keeping a watchful eye on the mother whose strength is spent, though her face glows with the pale triumph of survival. A widely known fact is that medieval mothers were often given spiced wine ale or broth immediately after delivery to restore energy, and you notice one attendant bringing forward a clay cup that steams faintly in the dim light, the aroma of cinnamon and honey mingling with the lingering scent of smoke. But a lesser-known detail lingers in the air as well. In some villages, the first food a mother ate after giving birth was believed to influence the child's temperament. So honey might bring sweetness, herbs might bring resilience, and bread might bring stability. Small acts of culinary superstition woven into the fabric of care. The women laugh softly as they encourage the mother to drink, one teasing that if she eats too much honey, the child will never stop talking, which draws a weak chuckle from her lips, the sound thin but filled with warmth. Historians still debate whether such traditions were purely symbolic or whether communities genuinely believed in their power, but either way they remind you of how deeply human it is to try to shape the unknown with small rituals. The baby stirs its cries quieter now, its face scrunching in tiny expressions that seem almost comically serious, and one attendant jokes that it already looks skeptical of the world it has just entered, a remark that brings fresh laughter and lightness to the weary group. The fire burns lower, the shadows stretch longer, and you feel time itself slowing in the room, as if this moment has been suspended for you to witness. You think about the countless times this scene has unfolded in history, each birth both utterly ordinary and profoundly miraculous, each one binding people together with bonds of shared endurance and joy. The midwife finally sits back, her shoulders sagging, her eyes soft with the satisfaction of another life safely brought forth, though she knows too well that her watch is not over, for the hours ahead remain fragile. Yet in this pause, she allows herself a moment of peace, leaning against the wall and smiling faintly at the chatter that fills the chamber. The women speak of names now, tossing suggestions lightly into the air, some serious, some teasing. And though no decision is made, you realize that naming is itself a celebration, a way of declaring that this tiny, fragile being belongs to the world. The mother strokes the baby's cheek with trembling fingers, her face caught between exhaustion and wonder, and the room softens further, the earlier tension now just a shadow lingering in memory. You breathe deeply, letting the mingled scents of herbs, smoke, and spiced wine fill your lungs, and you feel the pull of sleep settle over the house, the storm of labor giving way to a fragile but beautiful calm. And here in this dim chamber, lit by embers and softened by whispers, you sense not just the survival of one child, but the echo of a universal truth. that life continues fragile, yet resilient, through the simplest and hardest of acts, and that every cry, every laugh, every whispered blessing adds another thread to the long unbroken weave of human history. The chamber does not fall into silence after the child's cry, not completely. For though the sharpest tension has passed, there remains the quieter labor of aftercare, the gentle unfolding of rituals, the monitoring of the mother's body, and the first hesitant moments of the newborn's existence outside the womb, and you find yourself caught in this extended rhythm, slower now, less urgent, yet still carrying its own gravity, as if the night itself refuses to release its grip just yet. The mother leans against the stool, her body shaking with exhaustion, her face pale, and her breaths ragged, and though she looks worn to the bone, there is in her expression that unmistakable light of survival, a fire that has burned through pain to arrive here, at this fragile beginning. The midwife, ever vigilant, moves briskly though without panic, for she knows too well that danger lingers, even after the baby's first cries, that bleeding fever or weakness may still turn triumph into tragedy, so she does not allow herself rest, not yet. A widely known fact is that medieval women often faced the most peril in the hours after delivery, when the risk of blood loss and infection was highest, and so midwives remained close hands, steady eyes, sharp, keeping watch over every shift of color in the mother's cheeks, every tremor in her limbs. You notice the midwife checking the linen cloths, wiping gently, murmuring instructions to the attendants to bring fresh water and heat more broth, her voice calm, but carrying an authority that no one dares question, for in this moment her knowledge is the closest thing to salvation they have. And here appears a lesser-known detail, whispered in chronicles but rarely spoken aloud. Some midwives carried small pouches of herbs or charms sewn into their belts, not for medical use, but for protection, for they believed that unseen forces might still linger near the mother and child, jealous spirits or wandering souls, eager to snatch away fragile new life. And so these charms were thought to shield the vulnerable. You see her brush her fingers briefly across her belt before leaning back to the mother Essie's side. The attendants busy themselves with quiet efficiency, one warming cloths by the hearth, another preparing a shallow bowl of water with rosemary leaves floating atop it, their scent cutting through the heavier smells of sweat and smoke sharp and almost medicinal. You breathe deeply and feel that rosemary, as though it cleanses not just the room, but your own lungs, an herb that has walked hand in hand with memory and ritual for centuries. Historians still debate the precise role of these herbal waters. Were they genuinely used to cleanse wounds and soothe fevers, or were they more symbolic, a ritual washing away of the danger and fear that clung to the room? The truth may lie somewhere between, and you feel the ambiguity settle over you like mist, a reminder that history is not always a ledger of clear answers, but often a haze of overlapping belief and necessity. The mother sips from a clay cup of spiced ale, her lips trembling as she swallows the warmth seeping back into her cheeks bit by bit. One woman, clearly weary herself, leans down to whisper a joke, telling her that the child will owe her at least a lifetime of chores for all this effort. And though the mother cannot laugh fully, she does manage a faint smile, a small defiance against exhaustion. The baby shifts slightly, its cries softer now, its fists still clenched, as though unwilling to release the memory of the struggle it has just endured, and the midwife nods approvingly, saying that a loud child is a strong one, a declaration that draws murmurs of relief around the room. You catch sight of the attendants tidying, folding cloths, stacking used linens in baskets, all while still humming little tunes under their breath, the room alive with a kind of subdued industry, as though they cannot quite allow stillness to settle in just yet. Outside, faintly, you imagine the village stirring, for though the hour is deep, news of a birth travels swiftly, and neighbors may already be whispering to each other that a new cry has joined the world tonight. In some places, bells would be rung or candles placed in windows, though here it seems the celebration is quieter, folded into the walls of this home. Yet you recall a curious little detail from chronicles. In certain towns, when a child was born, neighbors might leave small tokens at the doorstep by dawn, bundles of bread, jars of milk, or sprigs of protective herbs, as if to weave the whole community into the fragile survival of the newborn. and you wonder if this household will find such offerings come morning. The midwife wipes her brow, her hands briefly trembling before she steadies them again, and you realize that though she wears an air of tireless competence, she too is human, weary and carrying the invisible burden of every birth she has guided. You think about how midwives were sometimes celebrated, sometimes feared, sometimes accused of witchcraft when outcomes turned dark, and the irony stings. For here you see only devotion, only skill, only the steady hands of someone who has walked beside life and death more times than she can count. The baby whimpers, its face scrunching, and the mother soothes it with a low murmur, rocking gently despite her fatigue, her body instinctively finding the rhythm of comfort. And the attendants smile, their eyes softened. For this is the moment that eases the memory of fear, the first quiet bonding that gives all the pain meaning. The fire pops softly, sending a few sparks upward, and the shadows dance across the rafters like watchful spirits. Someone mutters that the house will need to be smoked tomorrow to cleanse it of lingering sickness, a remark that sounds half practical, half superstitious, and another woman replies that rosemary smoke drives away more than illness, which earns a round of knowing nods. The night stretches long, the air heavy yet calm, and you realize that this is not just the aftermath of birth, but the beginning of a new rhythm. A slow weaving of life back into ordinary time, even as the extraordinary lingers in the air. You lean back slightly, feeling your own breath steady, your own muscles relax, caught in the quiet hum of this chamber where survival has been won, at least for tonight, and you allow yourself to imagine the dawn creeping closer, the first pale light that will spill across this room and remind everyone that a new day has come, a day that will carry with it both the memory of struggle and the promise of continuity. The room holds itself steady after the long night, though you sense that within its quiet hums an invisible shift, a slow turning of the world that no one can quite name yet, for a child's arrival, however common, however repeated through the centuries, is never quite ordinary, and this chamber now carries the weight of that transformation. The mother lies propped against cushions, her face pale yet peaceful, her hair damp and clinging to her temples, her hands trembling faintly as she strokes the small bundle nestled against her chest. The baby, wrapped snugly in swaddling cloths, emits soft whimpers that sound almost like the murmuring of a tiny bird, delicate yet insistent, a sound that weaves itself into the still air like a thread of reassurance. The attendants move slowly now, no longer hurried, tidying the space with quiet efficiency, folding linens, pouring cooled water into a basin, clearing away the signs of exertion. Their hands know these movements by memory, as though guided not by thought but by tradition, passed down through generations of women who have stood in similar rooms, faced similar hours, whispered similar prayers. In this softer moment, you notice the lingering details that might be overlooked during the urgency of birth. The faint smell of beeswax from the candles, their stubs now burned low, the way the rushes scattered across the floor hold a faint dampness from the water spilled earlier. The glint of a copper ladle resting beside the hearth, where broth still simmers, untouched yet fragrant. These ordinary objects hold significance tonight, transformed by the struggle they have witnessed, imbued with quiet symbolism. To drink broth, to light a candle, to wash with warm water, each act is both practical and ritual part of the tapestry of survival woven out of simple things. The midwife remains close, her posture still alert, though her body clearly longs for rest, for she knows her duty stretches beyond the moment of birth itself. She checks the mother's pulse, presses her palm gently against the woman's abdomen, listens for signs of bleeding or weakness, her eyes narrowing with the practiced intensity of one who cannot afford error. And here you recall how midwives often bore the weight not only of medical responsibility, but of superstition too. If a child grew weak or a mother fell ill, neighbors might whisper about curses or sins, and the midwife's name could be tangled in suspicion. She walks a narrow path, balanced between knowledge and belief, between healing and accusation, and yet she stands steady. Her hands, marked by calluses, steady the fragile boundary between life and death, and though no chronicler records her name, her work carries a legacy more enduring than the accounts of kings. The mother whispers faintly, asking whether the child is strong, whether its cry is a good sign, whether the bleeding will stop. The midwife answers with firm kindness, assuring her that the child's lungs are clear and its fists strong, that the blood has slowed, that she has done all she can. Still, the mother's eyes betray a lingering fear, one born not of this night alone, but of all the stories whispered through the years. Tales of women who never rose from the birthing stool, of fevers that consumed them days later, of children who slipped silently away before their first week. She knows too well that her survival tonight does not guarantee tomorrow, and yet she clings to the warmth of her baby, pressing her lips to its soft forehead as if to claim whatever protection love itself might offer. The baby stirs, its tiny fingers curling around the edge of the swaddling cloth, and the attendants murmur with approval. In some parts of medieval Europe, the grasping reflex was seen as a sign of a will to live, and women would gently place a finger into the infant's hand, delighted by the strength of its grip. You imagine the small ritual unfolding here, one attendant bending low, offering her finger to the child, smiling softly as its little hand closes around hers. This too is history. Not the grand events written in chronicles, but the intimate gestures of reassurance, the fleeting contact between new life and seasoned hands. Outside the chamber, the village begins to stir. A rooster crows faintly, announcing the slow crawl of dawn. Dogs bark somewhere in the distance, their voices carried on the crisp air. You sense the transition from night to day creeping closer, and with it the inevitable spread of news. A baby born in the night is not a secret that can be kept for long. Neighbors will ask questions, children will whisper, elders will nod knowingly. Perhaps by the time the sun rises, someone will leave bread or milk by the door, a quiet gift to aid the recovery of mother and child. In some traditions, sprigs of herbs, rosemary, sage, or juniper, might also be laid near the threshold, tokens not only of generosity, but of protection. For everyone in the village shares in the vulnerability of birth. Everyone knows the knife edge it walks. Inside, the midwife finally lowers herself onto a stool, her shoulders slumping, her eyes half closed, though she keeps her hands resting on her lap, ready to rise again at any moment. She has walked through dozens, perhaps hundreds of births, yet each one leaves its mark, a weight she cannot entirely put down. She murmurs a prayer under her breath, one so faint that even the attendants do not catch its words. But you imagine it is not for herself, but for the mother and child, for the fragile thread of life they now cling to. There is a moment then, brief, almost imperceptible, when the entire room seems to exhale together. The mother sighs deeply, her eyes fluttering closed as she drifts into a shallow sleep. The baby quiets, its breathing slow and steady. The attendants, too, allow themselves a moment of stillness, their bodies easing into the silence, as though they have all been holding the same breath and can now release it. The fire in the hearth burns lower, its flames softening into glowing embers. The air feels thicker, warmer, as though the room itself wraps around its occupants like a blanket. And in this quiet, you reflect on what has just unfolded. Not only the physical act of childbirth with its pain and blood and danger, but the larger human story it embodies. For in this small room lies the entire cycle of medieval life, the strength of women, often unrecorded yet essential, the mingling of knowledge and superstition, each inseparable from the other, the vulnerability of existence balanced against the stubborn persistence of survival. This moment, though seemingly ordinary, is a thread in a vast tapestry, connecting to countless others across time and place. You think of childbirth in other corners of the medieval world. In Japan, where women tied protective charms of red thread around their bellies; in West Africa, where midwives chanted to spirits for safe passage; in the Andes, where coca leaves were chewed to ease pain. Different practices, different landscapes, yet the same fundamental struggle. To guide new life safely into the world, to protect the mother's body, to honor the peril and miracle of birth. History often separates these worlds into neat compartments, but in truth they share a common heartbeat, one that echoes through centuries of whispered prayers and midnight labors. The baby shifts again, whimpering softly, and the mother stirs, pressing it closer. She does not open her eyes, yet her body moves instinctively, already attuned to the rhythm of care. You realize then that this is only the beginning. That the true labor lies not only in birth, but in the days, weeks, years that follow. Feeding, soothing, watching, guiding, an endless chain of acts that shape both mother and child. The chamber tonight holds only the first link in that chain, yet even this link feels monumental. The midwife finally stands, her joints cracking softly, and stretches her arms as though releasing the weight of the long night. She instructs the attendants in low tones to prepare more broth, to watch the mother closely, to keep the fire burning through the morning. Her words carry not just authority, but routine, for she knows too well that the work is never done, that vigilance must not falter. She glances once more at the mother and child, her gaze lingering longer than before, and you sense both relief and fatigue in her eyes, a complicated mixture of emotions she has learned to carry in silence. The first faint light of dawn begins to press against the shutters, a pale glow seeping through cracks in the wood. It does not yet flood the room, but it promises that the long night has ended. You feel that light brushing your skin, cool and fragile, and with it comes a sense of transition, as though history itself turns a page. The night of labor is over. The day of survival has begun. And so the chamber rests in this liminal space, balanced between exhaustion and renewal, between the memory of pain and the promise of growth. The fire crackles softly. The baby sighs. The mother sleeps. The midwife straightens her back, ready to face the dawn. And you too feel yourself carried into this rhythm, lulled by the quiet persistence of life, the steady hum of survival, the eternal pattern of birth and renewal that threads itself through the centuries, whispering gently into the present moment. The chamber around you now feels softer, quieter, as though it has shifted into a dream of itself. The edges blurred, the sounds hushed, the air gentled into something lighter, and you realize that you are no longer being pulled along by the urgency of birth, by the voices and the movements and the flicker of torchlight, but instead you are being carried into a slower rhythm, one that asks nothing of you except to breathe and to rest. The fire has burned down into glowing coals that pulse like a heartbeat, slow and steady, a rhythm you find yourself unconsciously matching with your own breath. Inhale with the glow, exhale with the dim, and each cycle feels easier than the last. The rushes on the floor no longer crunch underfoot, because no one is moving now. They simply rest, releasing a faint, earthy scent that mixes with the smoke and creates an atmosphere that feels grounding, like soil after rain, or like the safe heaviness of a blanket laid across you. Your body sinks deeper, not into a chair or a bed that you can name, but into the soft weight of time itself, the centuries folding gently around you as though they were sheets being tucked in at the corners. The mother rests, the child rests, the attendants rest. Even the midwife, for once, allows herself to close her eyes, if only for a moment, knowing that vigilance can wait until the sun rises higher. In this stillness, you notice how silence in itself can be a sound, how it hums faintly like the far-off tone of a bell, how it fills the spaces between heartbeats, how it makes you aware of just how quiet the world can be when it wishes to cradle you. You drift with that silence, and as you do, you begin to sense that the chamber is no longer bound by walls or beams or shutters, but instead stretches outward into a vast plain of history where all the births and labors and midwives and mothers of centuries past lie woven together into a tapestry too large to see in full. Each breath you take seems to carry the faint echo of another breath taken long ago. A woman in a Mongol tent inhaling the smoky air, a healer in the Andes exhaling after chanting, a midwife in a Viking hall steadying her hands as a cry rings out. They all ripple together now, not as individual moments, but as one endless wave rolling gently across the landscape of time, carrying you with it, not forward or backward, but sideways, into a softer place where time matters less and peace matters more. And it is here, in this softened plain, that your thoughts slow to the pace of clouds drifting lazily across a wide sky. They do not rush, they do not demand. They simply move, steady and unhurried, shapes dissolving into other shapes, never clinging, never resisting. You think of how in the medieval world people would often look to the sky for omens, reading patterns in the clouds or stars, searching for guidance in formations that could not be held. Tonight you do the same, though not for answers, but for comfort. to let the weight of thought slip away into the gentle shifting of forms above you, to let your mind dissolve like mist into the air. The baby in the chamber sighs in its sleep, a tiny sound that is both fragile and infinite, and that sigh seems to ripple outward, softening everything it touches. You feel it pass over you like a breeze, loosening the last knots in your chest, smoothing the small lines in your forehead, easing the clench of your jaw. You realize that your body too has been laboring in its own way, carrying the burdens of the day, the week, perhaps longer, just as the mother rests after her struggle. Just as the attendants release their tension, so too do you find yourself surrendering, allowing rest to claim you without resistance. The room darkens further, though whether it is night deepening or your eyes closing, you cannot tell. The air is warm but not heavy, like the perfect balance between blanket and breeze. Somewhere, perhaps imagined, a night bird calls softly, its tone low and steady, not startling but soothing, like the voice of someone humming under their breath as they work. That sound lingers in your ear, as though it were meant for you alone, a reminder that the world outside this chamber is still alive, still breathing, still steady in its own rhythm, and that you are part of it, safely woven into its pattern. As you lie in this space, you begin to feel the centuries peel away even more, until history itself seems to blur. You are no longer only in a medieval chamber, but also in the countless other rooms and huts and halls where births have taken place, where candles have flickered, where herbs have been burned, where whispered prayers have curled upward like smoke. Each place adds another layer of softness around you, another fold of fabric in the blanket of time. The details do not demand attention now. The exact herbs, the exact chants, the exact fears and hopes, they all merge into one gentle rhythm, the universal human hum of care and survival. And in this hum you are held, steady and secure. Your breath deepens, your chest rising and falling like waves on a calm shore. Each inhale feels like the tide reaching gently up the sand. Each exhale feels like the tide retreating, leaving the sand smooth and clean. The shore is endless, the ocean eternal, and you stand, or rather float, at the edge of it, balanced perfectly between land and sea, between waking and sleeping, between history and dream. The ocean does not rush, it does not demand. It simply exists, steady and infinite, and you find yourself matching its patience, your body loosening into its rhythm. Even the little flickers of thought that rise up, the to-do list, the worry, the half-remembered conversation, feel less like interruptions now and more like driftwood carried onto the sand. You watch them arrive, you watch them linger, and then you watch them drift back out with the tide. You do not need to chase them, you do not need to hold them, you do not need to judge them. They simply come and go, and you remain steady and calm. A shoreline that has seen countless tides and will see countless more, always enduring, always gentle. The baby shifts again, but this time you do not hear the sound with your ears so much as feel it in your chest, like a reminder of the cycle you have been witnessing all along. Struggle and relief, effort and rest, cry and sigh, birth and stillness. Each cycle ends in calm, and you too follow that pattern now, each breath carrying you deeper, each pause between breaths stretching longer, smoother, easier. You do not need to resist. You do not need to try. The calm is already here, wrapping around you like the softest wool, warmed by fire, scented faintly of earth and smoke. And so the chamber fades, the midwife fades, the attendants fade, the mother and child fade. Not into nothing, but into something broader, something quieter, something that feels like the embrace of time itself. You are no longer observing. You are no longer guiding. You are no longer even waiting. You are simply resting, suspended in a calm that asks for nothing but your breath. The centuries drift past like leaves on a river. The fire dims into a single coal. The world narrows into softness. And here in this narrowing, you let go. You do not need to hold them. You do not need to follow them. You do not need to explain them. You simply rest. The story has been told. The night has been walked, the child has been born, the chamber has quieted, and now you too may quiet. You are safe, you are steady, you are held. The past has given its stories, and now it gives you silence,